Part 1: The Perfect Storm. Growing up, I was always the dependable one in the family. The straight-A student, the good son who kept his head down and worked hard. My cousin, on the other hand, was the golden child in the most chaotic way. Let's call him Jake. Jake was charismatic, daring, and endlessly charming, but he was also reckless and directionless. His bad decisions stacked up like dominoes waiting to tumble, while I was over here, steadily building a tower of achievements. It wasn't until my senior year of high school that the scales tipped in a way I never could have anticipated. I had just received an acceptance letter to my dream university, a prestigious school I had worked tirelessly for years to get into. Scholarships were lined up, and the path to a better future felt like it was finally in reach. Then Jake got arrested, again. This time, though, it wasn't for something minor. He'd gotten involved in something big. Fraud or theft, I wasn't sure at first. But what mattered was that my uncle, who had always been a bit too proud of Jake's charisma, showed up at our house one evening with a desperate plea. "I need help," he said, his voice cracking. And Dad, as always, couldn't say no. Part 2: The Bargain. Our family was close, uncomfortably so, if I'm honest. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, you name it, we were all jammed into my grandparents' tiny living room, smiling through the chaos of too many people in one house. Dad and Uncle Rick were the ringleaders, always joking about how they'd been inseparable growing up. They loved telling us stories about their misadventures as kids, breaking into abandoned buildings, starting backyard fires, and racing homemade go-karts down the steepest hill in town. The loyalty they had for each other was almost enviable, until it wasn't. The night Uncle Rick came to our house, it was raining hard, and I could hear the splatter of his boots as he stomped them dry on the porch. He looked wrecked, like he hadn't slept in days. His hands were shaking, and he could barely get the words out. Jake had gotten himself into serious trouble. Something about stolen checks and an investigation that could snowball into prison time if they didn't act fast. "Please, man," Uncle Rick begged. "I wouldn't ask if I had any other options. This is Jake's last chance. I swear, he's going to turn things around." The look on my dad's face shifted. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples like the weight of the world had just landed squarely on his shoulders. For a minute, I thought he was going to say no. I thought he might finally draw a line. But then he sighed. "All right, Rick," Dad said quietly. "Let me figure something out." I wasn't in the room for most of their conversation, but I could hear the low murmur of voices as I sat upstairs, pretending to do homework. It wasn't until later that night, after Uncle Rick had gone home, that Dad sat me down to explain what he'd decided. "Your uncle's in a tough spot," he began, his tone heavy with what I now recognize as guilt. "And?" I prompted, not liking where this was going. "And I'm going to help him," Dad said, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. It took a moment for the implications to sink in. "With what money?" I asked, dread blooming in my chest. He hesitated for just a second too long. "No," I said, my voice rising. "No way. You can't take my college fund. That's my future. Jake's future is on the line too," Dad said firmly, like this was some kind of moral balancing act. "He's family. And family sticks together." "Family sticks together?" I shot back. "What about me? Don't I count as family? Or does that only apply to bailing out your favorite nephew?" Dad's jaw tightened. "Don't be dramatic. This isn't about favorites. It's about doing the right thing. Jake needs help, and we're in a position to give it to him. You'll figure things out, you always do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My voice cracked as I said, "This is my life we're talking about, Dad. My dream school, my chance to actually do something with myself. You're just throwing that away? You've got scholarships," he said dismissively, as if those would magically cover everything. "Not all of it," I shouted. "You know that. I've been saving for years, and now you're just going to—" "Enough!" Dad cut me off, his voice booming in a way that always made me freeze as a kid. I've made my decision, and that's final. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling and feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I wasn't just angry, I was heartbroken. Dad had always been my biggest supporter, the person who told me I could do anything if I worked hard enough. And now? Now he was the one slamming the door on everything I'd worked for, all because Jake couldn't stay out of trouble. The next morning, Dad was already on the phone with Uncle Rick, finalizing the transfer. My college fund, years of savings, birthday money, part-time job paychecks, was gone in the blink of an eye. Jake, meanwhile, didn't even seem fazed. He showed up a few days later to thank Dad with one of his trademark grins, like he hadn't just upended my entire future. "You're a lifesaver, Uncle Mike," he said, slapping Dad on the back. I stood there in the doorway, watching the two of them laugh like nothing was wrong, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't belong in my own family. Part 3: A World Collapsing. I spent the next few weeks in a haze, trying to figure out how to salvage my future. My acceptance to the university felt like a cruel joke now, a taunting reminder of everything that had slipped through my fingers. I couldn't stop thinking about how much I had given up just to reach this point, how many late nights I'd spent studying instead of sleeping, how many weekends I'd sacrificed to part-time jobs, and how many times I'd swallowed my pride and asked for extra shifts just to scrape together enough for my college fund. Now it was all gone, and for what? So Jake could skate by once again, thanks to my dad's misguided sense of family loyalty. I spent hours poring over financial aid options, but the reality was grim. The scholarships I had were good but not enough to cover everything. The university's financial aid office gave me a polite but firm "sorry," and the prospect of taking out massive loans loomed like a dark cloud over my head. At the same time, I couldn't ignore what was happening in my own house. My dad, who had always been my rock, now seemed like a stranger. He walked around like nothing was wrong, like his decision to sacrifice my future for Jake's was just another normal day. Meanwhile, my mom avoided the subject entirely, opting for quiet neutrality that only made me feel more isolated. Jake, of course, was thriving, or at least, as much as someone like Jake could thrive. With the legal fees and restitution paid off, the charges against him were dropped, and he was back to his usual antics in no time. He spent his days lounging at our house, cracking jokes and scrolling through his phone, as if he hadn't just bulldozed through my dreams. The worst part? He didn't even seem grateful. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to find him sprawled on the couch, eating chips and watching some reality show. "Hey, cuz," he said casually, barely glancing up. "How's it going?" "How do you think it's going?" I snapped. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Whoa, chill. What's your problem?" "My problem," I said, my voice shaking with anger, "is that I'm not going to my dream school because of you." Jake sat up, looking genuinely confused. "Wait, what does that have to do with me?" I stared at him, incredulous. "Are you serious? Dad used my college fund to bail you out." For a moment, Jake looked almost guilty. Almost. But then he shrugged. "Look, I didn't ask him to do that. That was his choice." "His choice?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're the one who got yourself into this mess in the first place. You don't even care, do you?" Jake rolled his eyes. "Of course I care. But it's not like I'm the bad guy here. Your dad made the call, not me. Don't take it out on me just because you're pissed at him." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jake had always been self-centered, but this was a new level of audacity. Before I could say anything else, he turned back to the TV, effectively ending the conversation. That night, I sat in my room, staring at my acceptance letter and trying not to cry. The words on the page felt meaningless now, just another reminder of what could have been. I wanted to scream at my dad, to make him understand how much he had taken from me. But every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. Instead, I bottled up my anger and focused on finding a solution. I started applying for part-time jobs around town, hoping to scrape together enough to make up the difference. I even looked into cheaper schools, though the thought of settling for less felt like another slap in the face. Through it all, Dad remained steadfast in his decision. "You'll figure it out," he said whenever I brought it up, as if that was supposed to make everything better. "You're smart, and you're a hard worker. You'll be fine." Fine. That's what he thought. I'd be fine while Jake got to skate by without a care in the world. I'd be fine while my dreams slipped further and further out of reach. I'd be fine while the person I had always looked up to, my own father, proved that I wasn't as important as the cousin who couldn't stay out of trouble. For the first time in my life, I felt like I couldn't count on him. And that realization hurt more than anything else. Part 4: The Fallout. The day I watched Jake stroll into our house like a conquering hero, I thought I might lose my mind. He and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Dad had even poured him a glass of his prized bourbon, the one he usually saved for special occasions. I stood there in the doorway, fuming silently. Jake had this way of making himself the center of attention, and that day was no different. He was going on about how he had big plans to start over, maybe even move out to California. "I've got some friends out there," he said, gesturing with his glass. "They've got connections, you know? Music industry stuff. Could be a good opportunity." Dad nodded along like Jake had just outlined a master class on pulling your life together. "That's great, Jake. I'm glad you're thinking about the future." Thinking about the future? I wanted to scream. Jake's idea of planning for the future was a half-baked scheme to leech off some other poor soul. Meanwhile, I was drowning under the weight of the future I could no longer afford. As they talked, I grabbed a glass of water and tried to ignore them. But when Jake started talking about how he deserved a fresh start, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Deserve?" I said, spinning around to face him. "You think you deserve a fresh start? After everything you've done?" The room went silent. Jake looked up at me, his easy grin faltering. "Whoa, what's your deal?" "My deal," I said, my voice trembling with anger, "is that you've wrecked my life, and you don't even care." Dad stood up, his face stern. "That's enough, my name." "No, it's not enough," I snapped, turning to him. "You took everything I worked for and handed it to him on a silver platter. And now he's sitting here, drinking your bourbon, talking about California like it's some kind of joke." "Hey, I didn't ask for any of this," Jake interjected, his tone defensive. "Didn't you?" I shot back. "You didn't ask for Dad to bail you out? You didn't ask him to sacrifice my future so you could keep screwing up without consequences?" Jake rolled his eyes. "Look, I'm sorry you're upset, but it's not my fault your dad made that call." "You're unbelievable," I said, shaking my head. "You don't even see what you've done. And you," I added, turning back to Dad, "you're just as bad. You're so desperate to save Jake that you don't care who you have to hurt to do it." "That's enough," Dad said again, his voice louder this time. "Jake's family, and he needed help. We did the right thing." "The right thing?" I laughed bitterly. "The right thing would have been letting him face the consequences of his actions. But no, you just couldn't let your golden boy fail, could you?" Dad's face hardened. "You're out of line." "Am I?" I asked. "Or am I just finally saying what everyone else is too afraid to say?" Jake stood up then, his expression somewhere between annoyed and embarrassed. "All right, I'm out of here," he said, grabbing his jacket. "Thanks for the drink, Uncle Mike." I watched him walk out the door, my hands clenched into fists. I wanted to chase after him, to yell at him until he understood how much damage he'd done. But what was the point? Jake would never take responsibility for his actions. And Dad? Dad had made it clear where his priorities lay. After Jake left, the tension in the room was unbearable. Dad didn't say anything, just started cleaning up the glasses on the table. I stood there for a moment, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he stayed silent. Finally, I broke the silence. "You know this isn't fair, right? You know what you've done to me?" Dad sighed heavily, setting the glasses down in the sink. "Life isn't fair, my name. Sometimes you have to make tough choices." "No," I said, my voice breaking. You didn't have to make this choice. You chose to. And you chose Jake over me. Dad turned to face me, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said finally. And just like that, the conversation was over. The fallout wasn't just between me and Dad, though. The whole family started to feel the strain. My mom, who had stayed out of it as much as she could, began tiptoeing around me like she was afraid to say the wrong thing. My siblings, if I had any, didn't want to take sides, but I could see the tension in their eyes whenever Jake's name came up. And Uncle Rick? He was practically a ghost, avoiding me at every family gathering like he couldn't stand to face the person whose life his son had derailed. For weeks, I felt like I was walking around in a fog, my anger and frustration simmering just below the surface. Every time I saw Dad and Jake together, laughing like old friends, it felt like another knife to the heart. And every time I thought about what I had lost, the weight of it all threatened to crush me. I didn't know how to move forward. All I knew was that the people who were supposed to support me, the people I had trusted most, had let me down in the worst way POS. Part 5, Breaking Point. A month after the fallout, I overheard Dad on the phone with Uncle Rick, bragging about how Jake was finally getting his act together, and deserved another chance. That word, deserved, set me off. I stormed into the living room, unable to hold it in anymore. What about me, Dad? I asked, my voice shaking. Don't I deserve a chance too? Dad sighed, already defensive. This isn't about you. Jake needed help, and we did the right thing. The right thing? I snapped. The right thing would have been letting him face the consequences of his own actions. You gave away everything I worked for like it was nothing. You'll figure it out, Dad said, dismissive as ever. I laughed bitterly, the hurt bubbling to the surface. Stop saying that. You don't care about me figuring it out. You just wanted to fix Jake's mess because you care more about him than me. Dad stiffened, shaking his head. That's not true. Isn't it? I said. Because it sure feels like it. I'm done waiting for you to see what you've done, Dad. He didn't say anything, just turned away like the conversation was over. And maybe it was. That night, I decided I'd stop hoping he'd understand. If I was going to move forward, I'd have to do it without him. But no matter how hard I tried, the pain of knowing where I stood in his priorities lingered. Some wounds just don't heal. Part 6, Moving On. Years have passed since that night, but the bitterness still lingers like an unwelcome guest. It's not that I haven't moved forward, I have, in a lot of ways. I went to a state school instead of my dream university, worked multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet, and slowly built a decent life for myself. On paper, I'm doing fine. But some scars don't fade. Jake, predictably, hasn't changed much. He still hops from one opportunity to the next, leaving a trail of half-baked plans and broken promises behind him. Last I heard, he was living in California, trying to break into some niche industry that required minimal effort but promised maximum payoff. Dad still checks in on him regularly, even sending him money now and then to help him out. Meanwhile, Dad and I barely talk. Our relationship never recovered from what happened, and honestly, I don't think it ever will. Every time we're in the same room, there's this unspoken tension, like we're both waiting for the other to bring up the past. He still doesn't seem to understand why I'm so angry, or maybe he just doesn't want to face it. The last time we spoke about it was at a family gathering. Jake wasn't there, probably too busy chasing his latest pipe dream, but his name came up, as it always does. Jake's doing better these days, Dad said, like he was giving me a status update on a mutual friend. I couldn't help myself. Better compared to what? The bar is practically underground. Dad frowned, clearly irritated. He's trying my name. Not everyone has it as easy as you. I laughed bitterly. Easy? You think my life's been easy? You've always been resilient, Dad said, as if that made everything okay. And there it was, the same excuse he'd used all those years ago. I realized in that moment that I would never get the closure I wanted from him. He would never admit he was wrong, never apologize for choosing Jake over me. So I stopped waiting for it. It hasn't been easy to let go of the resentment. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself replaying the events in my head, imagining how things could have been different if Dad had made a different choice. But I know those thoughts don't change anything. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't force people to see your pain. You can't make them understand what they've taken from you, especially if they're too caught up in their own version of the story. I don't regret working hard to rebuild my life. It's made me stronger in ways I didn't expect. But I do regret the loss of what could have been. Not just my dream school or the career path I once envisioned, but the relationship I thought I had with my dad. Sometimes, I wonder if Dad ever thinks about what he gave up, if he ever regrets the choice he made. But I've stopped waiting for answers. These days, I'm focused on building a life that no one can take away from me, a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or support. Still, there are moments when the pain sneaks up on me, like when I see fathers and sons who seem genuinely close, laughing and supporting each other without hesitation. I wonder if things could have been like that for us, if only he'd made a different choice. But those are fleeting thoughts, and I've learned to push them aside. My life is mine now, and for better or worse, I'm determined to make it count. Jake might still be chasing shortcuts, and Dad might still be clinging to his misguided sense of loyalty, but I've stopped letting their choices define me. I've learned that sometimes, family loyalty comes at too high a cost. And sometimes, the only way to truly move on is to let go, even if it means letting go of the people you once loved the most.